hearing this lecture again, because I will be giving this in his class, but I won't be going into quite as much detail in his class. I'm going to give you guys a little more detail about stuff, and also try to make it a little more relevant to Asian thought. And so we're going to talk about Carl Jung, and I think I mentioned last time that Jung was a disciple of Freud, younger than Freud, and they had this sort of bromance, infatuation with each other, and I think I explained the reasons why that was. And then they had a breakup, and the breakup was over something that now, to me, seems to be relatively trivial, but at the time was a sort of earth-shattering thing, especially for Freud, that he had his main disciple sort of going off and adding his own ideas into Freud's view of the psyche. And that's what initiated the breakup, and once they broke up, that was basically it. They didn't really have much to do with each other officially anymore, even though some people will have argued that some of Freud's later ideas, like the introduction of the concept of thanatos, were in response to Jung's work. That he had to modify a little bit because people were saying, yeah, there's other stuff out there besides just Eros. And so Freud sort of reluctantly came with this idea of thanatos in this very pretzel-y logic sort of way, introduced the idea of aggression as a drive. Okay? And I think, I don't know if I mentioned this last time, but the funny thing is that nowadays in the modern world, Freudian and Jungian psychology are so very similar compared to other systems of psychology. And so the fact that they continue to maintain their tribalism and be in their own little tribes and not talk to each other too much, I think is really quite a shame, because they really have a lot more similarity than they do difference. Okay? And some of the difference really reflects the patients that Freud and Jung work with. That Freud worked with what we would now call neurotic patients, or maybe we might even say some of them were probably a little personality disordered. And Jung really began his career working with psychotic individuals. And so you can see Jung and Freud's theories from the lens of the patients they were working through. It makes a lot more sense. Freud's patients were people who had lots of developmental trauma. They were obviously repressing things. A lot of their issues sprung from their own personal unconscious stuff. As were Jung's patients were psychotic, and a lot of their issues and a lot of what they were expressing really seemed to come from someplace beyond the individual. And the word that has been coined in psychology is transpersonal. These images, these things were coming to these psychotic individuals seem to be beyond the individual. Transpersonal, beyond what somebody, their own experience could have been repressed into the unconscious. And again, if you've ever worked with psychotic individuals, this becomes really, really quite apparent. And I think I mentioned you guys, when I was many of your ages, I was working my way through college. I worked at a locked-in mental facility on the night shift. I was usually on the graveyard shift. And most of the people in that facility were psychotic, had psychotic illness. And some of the things that these folks would report were things that they just couldn't have experienced on their own, and they couldn't have read about them, but they were experiencing hallucinations and hearing voices and seeing things that were just way beyond what they themselves could have experienced. And a lot of these things that they saw, a lot of these hallucinations had mythological motifs to them, and were stuff that just was not obviously something this person had repressed into their personal unconscious, like a neurotic individual. And so when again, when I was younger, Jung very much appealed to me. When I was actually, when I first started studying psychology, I never cracked a book of Freud. I didn't crack a book of Freud until graduate school, because I thought Freud was wrong. I worked with psychotic individuals. I worked with them every night. I was hearing this stuff. I was reading Jung constantly, and Jung was talking about these mythological motifs and these what he'll call archetypal patterns, and I was seeing these all day long with clients at my work. And so Freud didn't make sense to me, because I was coming from a place of looking at the expressions of psychotic individuals. it was only when I started working with more sort of neurotic level people that you really see the Freudian stuff come to the fore. So it's like Freud and Jung are describing similar phenomenon, but they're coming at it from a different angle, if that makes sense. Okay. And I'll give you an example of this sort of transpersonal stuff. In a client I had, I worked in this locked-in middle facility, and I had a client, and he had been a farm worker. He had immigrated from somewhere in Latin America, come up here, and he was a farm worker. And somewhere along the line, this poor guy had contracted syphilis. And syphilis is one of these diseases. You get it, you get some sores, but if you don't treat it, what happens is the sores go away and it becomes asymptomatic, but it remains in the body and it can actually spread to the different parts of the body, and eventually, if it's untreated long enough, it can spread to the brain. And once it gets to that level, tertiary, quaternary syphilis, it's pretty much fatal, and it's just a matter of time. And this guy had, he had it in the brain, and he became quite disabled by this, and would spend most of his day standing around doing what appeared to be hallucinating. And one day he was out in the yard and he was standing out and he was kind of staring up, at the sky. The sun was over there. He wasn't staring directly at the sun. He was staring up at the sky, just like his eyes wide open. And I came up to him and I said, "Well, what do you see? What are you looking at?" And he said, "I see a crystal city. I see a city carved out of stone and glass. I see the sun, and from the sun, a long string of beads is coming out of the center of the sun and is coming down to me, down to earth." I was like, whoa. And then, having read Jung, I went and started looking up the symbolists for this, and if you, I think it's Mayan or Aztec legends, you find some of the same symbolism. And he was describing seeing serpents and peacocks and, this sort of Aztec motif stuff. Now, maybe he picked some of that up during his lifetime. That's possible, because, that was, his background. But some of the other stuff, he wouldn't have been reading, Joseph Campbell or mythology or thing. In fact, the guy was quite illiterate. He really couldn't read. And yet he was seeing all this stuff, elaborate visions of these things. It's crystal cities floating in the sky and this kind of stuff. And again, if you read some of these legends, like he's just channeling that stuff's just coming through it. And so I would often, my clients would, sometimes report things like this. And I really became convinced that Jung was really onto something with this. Okay. Now, later on in my life, I would be doing therapy. People would come in the office. What's going on? Well, I've got this thing going on here. I can't seem to get along with any bosses I have at work. Every time I get a job, I end up getting in a conflict with my boss and fighting with them. I can't stand authority figures. Oh, Oedipal complex. And then another patient would come in. Oh, I can't stand, I fight with my mom all the time. Oedipal complex. And then you start seeing with neurotic people, everybody comes in, everybody has some variation of an Oedipal complex. And so, Freudian viewpoint, well, that Jungian stuff is, it's way out in the ozone. All the people coming in the office have Oedipal issues. And so if you're Freudian, you say, oh, well, it's Oedipal stuff, right? So again, depending on who you're working with, what kind of clients you're seeing, you may experience that. And I certainly, as a psychotherapist in practice, and seeing people coming in, for whatever problems they had, the Oedipal issues were everywhere. And once you start getting acclimated to that, you just see it everywhere. And so Freud, Freud's really right too. Freud was really onto something too, right? So my contention, because I don't belong to either a Freud or Jung tribe, my contention is that both viewpoints are very, very useful. Now, Jung actually said this. He said, if people come in to see me and they've got developmental issues, neurotic issues, I work with them in a Freudian way. If they come in with something else, I work with something that's more dealing with this transpersonal level of stuff. Freud was not so expansive. Freud just, felt that Jung stuff was just out there in the ozone and would have nothing to do with it. Okay. All right. Now I'll give you a little background. So what Freud does, Freud's talking about the ego, which has our consciousness, and then this personal unconscious. Again, I described to you stuff bubbles up, and then it's unacceptable to the conscious mind. the ego, so it gets repressed back down into the personal unconscious, and this creates all sorts of anxiety and symptoms and things like this. And then when you go to analysis, you spend time bringing this personal unconsciousness into consciousness, and then that will alleviate, hopefully, the symptoms that person is having. And that's a very simplistic way of viewing it, but that's really what's going on. To this system, Jung adds the idea that there is this transpersonal level, which he called the collective unconscious. And I'll talk a little bit more about the collective unconscious in a minute, but the collective unconscious is the repository of all this sort of energy that is possible, you know, in human beings. Okay? So it can really be, so rather than having just Eros and Thanatos, you can have all sorts of different kinds of energy coming to you. You know, almost anything that is found in human experience can be found in the collective unconscious in a sort of idealized way that can come and motivate and drive human behavior. Okay, so this really opens up this idea of the unconscious quite a bit. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Because the thing that we find that it gets expressed from the collective unconscious is something Jung called archetypes. Archetypes. And these are usually things that come in personified images. And they represent the energy from the collective unconscious. And there's a number of archetypes. Really, there's thousands and thousands and millions. Anything that has to relate to human existence can have an archetype. And I'll talk to you about some of the common ones. Okay? Anything that we have in common as human beings. For instance, we all have a mother, right? So there can be a mother archetype. We all have a father. We all have the experience of being a child, having a parent, and being a child in relationship with those parents, and so we can be a child. All these different kinds of archetypes out there, and I'll talk about some of those in a minute. So for Jung, the ego is very similar to what Freud postulated. It's the focal point of consciousness, bearer of identity, organizes thoughts and intuitions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it still has this executive function. Okay? So pretty much the same. The difference is that Jung also adds sort of flavors to the ego. And he talks about ego types and ego type functions. And you guys know this from the Myers-Briggs type inventory that you'll probably learn about in Dr. Baker's personality theory class, that in Jung's system, the ego has 4 different ways of perceiving and interpreting reality, or in ways of responding to it. So this is almost like, you know, you put on a pair of like golden sunglasses and you walk outside and everything looks like it's tinged golden, right? Or you put on rose-colored glasses and everything looks rosy, right? It's just the same idea. Your ego has a style in the way that it responds to the outside world. And again, Jung talked about this. And the main 4 things that Jung talked about, really, these are 2 pairs, are feeling and thinking, and intuition and sensation. And we tend to gravitate toward one or the other, either intuition or sensation, and feeling or thinking. We tend to be a little bit more one than the other. Okay? And I'm going to talk about these in more detail. Okay? Thinking function, analytic, rational way of perceiving the world. Feeling is a different way of, more emotional way of perceiving the world. Sensation is an orientation to physical reality, and intuition is an orientation to inward reality, psychic reality. And those are the big main ones that Jung came up with. He also later on came up with the idea of introvert and extrovert, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, let's talk about thinking. Okay? A person whose style is a thinking function, dominant ego function is thinking, often appears detached and unemotional. I put this Spock up, the old Spock, because the new one is a little less thinking. He kind of is a badass. He gets in fights and gets pissed off and stuff. I like him though. Quinto, what's his name? He's good. He's really good. But the old Spock, you know, cut all that stuff off. You know, just thinking, deals the world in a thinking way. Thinking people have a dominant thinking function, don't negotiate emotional situations necessarily very well, and they try to rationally, you know, deal with situations that involve emotion or perceiving emotions in others, and it just gets them into trouble. I don't know if you saw this movie. You guys remember this movie? But you think of Dr. Evil as a little bit of a thinking person, and has a little one-night thing here, and the next morning, they're having breakfast, and he's like, oh, it's, kind of workplace romance. Oh, it's awkward now, right? And he doesn't really know how to deal with it. So I took this picture. So I like this movie. Yeah. But negotiating emotional romantic situations hard for a thinking person, right? It's hard sometimes for thinking people to even get into romantic situations, right? This is why when you go, to a college where they have an engineering school, you got a bunch of nerds who, have a hard time if they're men meeting women, if they're women meeting men. This is sort of become the cultural stereotype. And if you watch, TV shows like The Big Bang Theory, you have these nerdy science guys who are purely sort of thinking function, heads on a stick. They have a hard time, meeting people for romantic situations. Now, feeling function. I put a picture of Oprah up there. She's a great feeling function person. Feeling function people are very empathic. They have a value-based emotional way of perceiving the world. In other words, you accept or reject an idea or something out there on the basis of whether or not it's pleasant or unpleasant. How does it make you feel? Okay? You get a gut instinct about something. I don't feel that good about this, so I don't like it, right? Now, in a way, thinking and feeling are both rational because they both require an active judgment. It's just the thinking judgment is based on making sort of logical thought, and a feeling judgment is based on emotionally whether something is pleasant or unpleasant, whether it appeals to you emotionally. Now we talk about sensation functions. This refers to conscious perception through the sense organs, and sensation personality type relates to physical stimuli. They have to feel, taste, touch, smell something for it to really register for them, right? And the great example of this is Johnny Knoxville. He's a great sensation type person, right? He's made a whole living out of being this ultra sensation type person. These are people who respond to the physical world. You'll find people who are sensation types often go into professions where they're actually out there, where the world is impinging on them in some sort of physical way, firefighters, people like this, cops, boxers, football players, somebody there's a physical aspect to their job, right? Now, intuition function is like a sensation in that it's an experience which immediately is given to consciousness rather than rising through some mental activity, thinking or feeling. But unlike sensation, it has no physical cause. So the intuition is sort of the opposite of sensation in that it's something that comes directly to you, but it doesn't have a physical cause. Johnny Knoxville gets his nipple bitten by an alligator, that immediately registers with him. When Captain Kirk is in a battle and he just suddenly knows what to do, that's an intuition. Okay? It's not coming from a physical thing. It's just coming from, whatever the situation is. It's coming from inside. Okay? A hunch, a gut level feeling, or an ESP-like experience. And it's often, this intuition function often related to inspiration, creativity, etc. Okay? Now, sensation and intuition are both irrational because they involve no reasoning. They simply result from stimulus. Okay? So for the sensation guy, the stimulus is external, and for the intuition person, the stimulus is just some internal thing. Okay? And I put the original Captain Kirk up here. The new Captain Kirk's pretty good too. He would have been fine to put up here. Okay? But he's pretty good, pretty similar to the old one. But the old one, he'd just have a hunch about stuff. He'd outsmart people just because he had a feeling. He had a great, really powerful intuition, and he could use that very well. Okay? Now, people came along after Jung, Myers and Briggs, who were a mom and daughter, and they decided to take Jung's ideas and create this test, the Myers-Briggs type inventory. And they also included this idea of introvert and extrovert, which Jung also talks about. And introverts and extroverts are now kind of seen as the overall big picture categorization. Okay? And introverts and extroverts are very interesting. Introverts are concerned with inner facts, inner experience, inner reality, and extroverts are concerned with the outer world. But you can be an extrovert and still do something, have a job where you're by yourself, you're doing something, thinking about something. Or you can be an introvert and have a job where you do something extroverted. And I'm a really good example of the latter. I take the Myers-Briggs, I score, all the way over on the introverted side. I'm very, very introverted. If I had my druthers, I'd be sitting in a dark room listening to goth music, you know, with foil on the windows, burning black candles, and not having anybody within a, you know, 5-mile radius of me, you know. But over the time, I have done something that Jung talked about, which is to develop my inferior function. I've developed my capacity for doing extroverted things, mostly because it's my job to get up in front of large groups of people and talk for hours and hours. And now I find if I don't do it, I'll start jonesing for it. You know, if I don't have, not teaching a big lecture class, I'll be wandering the street getting people, hey, let me tell you about Jung, you know, and start lecturing, right? So I've developed that function. The big difference between introvert and extrovert is really where your energy comes from, okay? So I can come and talk to you guys. I love talking to you guys. I love teaching. I love talking in front of big groups of people. The bigger, the better. But at the end of the day, when I'm out here doing my extroverted thing, after I'm done, I will need to go home and be alone by myself for a while, and that's how I recharge my batteries, okay? If I'm an extrovert, I could sit all day at the computer in a little cubicle by myself and do statistics problems and, you know, but at the end of the day, to recharge my batteries, I gotta go out and go to a party and hang out with other people. And that's the real big difference between introverts and extroverts. And that's the big difference, is where your energy comes from. Introverts, they get their energy from being alone. Extroverts get energy from being around other people. Okay? And that will help you, by the way, if you were in a relationship with somebody who's the opposite of you, which is very common. Because I come home from work, I'm tired, I've been teaching all day, I've been around people all day, I just want to sit around and be by myself. My wife, who is a very extroverted person, comes home. She's been sitting in her office writing all day by herself. She wants to go out as soon as she gets home, right? And so we end up having a fight about that, right? But now, if you understand, oh, because she's an extrovert, she needs to recharge her energy by being around people, and she understands I'm an introvert, I need to recharge my energy by being by myself, then we can kind of come to some sort of compromise about what we're going to do. And it helps understand, and it helps deal with the relationship. And actually, there are psychologists who will use this, the Myers-Briggs, to counsel people about how they can get along better, either in a relationship or a work situation, that kind of thing. All right, and then we have in the Myers-Briggs sensation and intuition, which is sensing and intuitive. And again, we talked about this already, and then thinking and feeling. And then what they do is they take these sensing and intuitive and thinking and feeling, and from that they derive this other category, which is judging and perceiving, which to my mind is sort of the one out of all these things that is not as useful as the other ones. But again, it sort of relates to sensing, intuitive, and thinking and feeling a little bit. And judging and perceiving is the preferred relationship to the outside world. The judging person needs closure, you need to make a decision, come to some completion. The perceiving person is always looking for new information. They're always sort of looking, well, we always can see if there's something else out there we could add to the mix before we make a decision. So they tend to be a little more indecisive, keeping the question open. And you can put these together and you can get all these wonderful types. And again, I'm not going to go into detail about these because you're going to learn about these in personality theory class. Hopefully, if you take it with Dr. Baker, I know for sure you will. He'll actually give you this, you'll take it home and test yourself. You can go online, there's some very good online versions, short online versions of the Myers-Briggs that correlate something like 0.9 with like the actual Myers-Briggs, which is really long and expensive to take. So you can do the online ones and they tend to work just fine. And you can get your category here and learn about stuff. Okay. And we talked about this already. Freud, we think, probably was a very extroverted guy. He liked going out and talking to people and talking out his ideas. Jung was an extreme introvert. Jung, broke up with Freud and basically had a nervous breakdown and went off and just stayed by himself for like a couple years and hardly interacted with people at all. He was very introverted. Now, Jung's idea of the personal unconscious, I mentioned, is very similar to Freud, made up of forgotten, repressed stuff. However, Jung talks about something that is sort of at the boundary of the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious, and that's the idea of a complex. Now, he talked about complexes before he came up with the idea of the collective unconscious, so he really places these within the personal unconscious. But later on, what happens with the complexes, they also mix in stuff from the collective unconscious. And you can almost think of it as like a knot. You've got stuff that you've repressed from your own conscious mind. You've got stuff from the collective unconscious, and those things bind up together, and then they bind up psychic energy, and that then affects your waking life. It affects you in some way. It can be like a neuroses of something. You've all heard, oh, that person has a mother complex, or that person has an Oedipal complex, right? Because remember this, he came up with this before he had the other stuff, before he left Freud. So we talked about an Oedipal complex, right? So I can't get along with my boss at work. Every time I get a job, I always end up getting in a fight with my boss and getting fired. Well, that's because I have an Oedipal complex, and so I see all my bosses like they are a father figure who I'm rebelling against, and I just, because I didn't negotiate that well when I was growing up, and now I got to go into therapy and deal with that, right? So I have a complex. So for Jung, the difference is these complex can have some influence from the collective unconscious. And oftentimes they're in opposition to the conscious mind. I don't want to get in a fight with my boss. I want to keep my job. I love my job. But I can't seem to help myself. I can't seem to help goading him or challenging him and getting in a fight and then getting fired. It just happens over and over and over and over again. Okay? So this is the kind of a complex thing. Okay? After Freudian, you might just say this is kind of the typical neurosis. But Jung's definition of neurosis includes this collective, a little bit of this collective stuff. Okay. Now, let's talk about the collective unconscious in particular. I mentioned most of the stuff already. Jung saw this stuff in patients that was what he felt transpersonal. Again, these psychotic patients he started with. But then, of course, he worked with non-psychotic people, and he found same sorts of material in the dreams that they would report to him. So while Freud would see the dreams as just having eros and thanatos, Jung started looking in the dreams, and because he was sensitized to it, started seeing all sorts of stuff from this collective unconscious, this transpersonal material. Mythological motifs, universal themes that the dreamer could not have repressed from their conscious minds or learned about in some way. And Jung looked at this in two ways, and these are somewhat contradictory, but he spoke about the collective unconscious in both ways. And one is that this material in the collective unconscious comes from our heritage of humanity, our biology, our evolutionary past, our programming. Okay? In other words, we all in this room have a mother, right? You're not here unless you had a mom of some sort. Whether you live with that mom or not, you had a mom. And every creature that led up to you over countless generations also had a mother. All the way back a billion years until you get to like one-celled animals who also had mothers, but their mothering maybe had a different kind of thing. So we have in our heritage, let's say of human beings, we don't need to go back even to animals, but we just say our heritage of human beings as primates go back a million years or something. We've all had an experience of what it's like to have a mother. That experience, or that, the way we respond to the mother has probably been to some degree shaped by evolution. In other words, you have a mother, you love your mother, when you're a little kid, you want your mother, you stick around your mother helps you. You respond to your mother in a certain way evolutionarily because it had survival value. You just popped out of the womb, and as soon as you could walk, you said, oh, mother, I'm going to take off. Not paying attention to your mother, those ancestors we had didn't survive, didn't pass on their genes. We are the product of creatures that pass on the genes for loving their mother, for being bonded to their mother. And so we have a certain relationship to mothers. For Jung, that becomes an archetype. That becomes something that can influence our waking life. That this universal programming toward responding to a mother. And then what happens is Jung would see dreams, and people would have dreams of these mother figures, and they would come in and they would be exerting they would then bind up perhaps with stuff from the personal unconscious, and then exert some influence over waking life. And so especially if your mother was, maybe you're overbearing, maybe she took care of you, and guys like this, right, the mom does everything. Anybody watch Jersey Shore? Greatest psychological experiment ever filmed, pathological psychology experiment ever filmed, right? Well, remember Vinny? Vinny is the kind of normal one. You see Vinny interacting with his mom. He's a mom complex, right? His mom does everything. He's a grown man, 30 years old. His mom cooks for him. She cleans for him. He lives in the house with his mom. It's not that he doesn't go out. He has girlfriends, you know. He has fun. He does, but he's still attached to his mom. He hasn't individuated from his mom, right? His mom still does everything for him, right? So you get Vinny on the couch, you know, in a Jungian office, you're going to find all sorts of mother archetype stuff coming out, right? Okay, there's some mother archetype there, right, that he hasn't dealt with. Yes? We're going to get to that. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. So collective unconscious is sort of the repository of all this kind of energy. Okay, all this energy that from Jung can come, first of all, from our heritage, our evolutionary past, our biological programming, if you will. And that's a very scientific way of looking at this, right? And people have talked about this. That, we have some scientists and biologists writing about this as if this could be really a biologically. It makes sense. We have certain kinds of programming. We know that. So this kind of, in a way, makes a lot of sense. But then Jung talks about it in another way. He talks about it in a kind of a spiritual way, okay? Spiritual way, which is sort of this sort of repository of energy that's floating around there out in the ether, and we, you know, and maybe it's related to God. Jung was a religious person. He was a Christian. He believed in God. They asked him near the end of his life, they said, you know, Dr. Jung, do you believe in God? He said, no. He goes, I know there's God. So for him, it wasn't a belief. For him, it was a direct experience of what he would call the numinous, you know, the numinous reality, the reality of God. So he was a very spiritual, very religious person, right? So for him, it was not, you know, it wasn't a contradiction. Yes, it could be this, you know, scientific sort of, you know, evolutionary thing. It could also just be that there's a spiritual dimension that maybe underlies or overlies our regular reality, where all this stuff can kind of come down through to us. Okay, does that sound familiar to anything we've talked about so far? I talked about what is Asian thought and what Asian thought has in common with, you know, with each other. Yet that there's this kind of underlying, overlying reality that we don't necessarily see, perceive directly, but is there and can influence us. Well, Jung's idea of the collective unconscious is very similar to this. Okay, very similar. And Jung thought about the collective unconscious in this spiritual way. And one page he'd write about it as a biological thing, and the next page he'd write about it as a spiritual thing. He did not seem to be too worried about the contradictions of these things. It was both for him. It could be both. And they're not necessarily contradicted, but they really do require a different sort of mindset. Because the spiritual one really comes, you know, not only from Christian philosophy, but also from Plato and Aristotle, you know, the Greek philosophers who influenced Christianity the most. And again, this Platonic idea is very interesting, where you have this energy that's out there, and this energy usually comes to us in some sort of form. There's an idealized form for everything out there. Okay, there's an idealized form for everything out there. Okay, for instance, you are sitting in a chair, right? Desk, but it's a chair, right? There's a chair, something to sit on. But if I brought this over, right? You recognize this as a chair too. It's different than that, but this is also a chair, right? Or I could even get something that's even more different. Bring this over, right? This. You also see this as a chair, and I could bring in, you know, all sorts of different chairs, and you all recognize these as chairs, even though they're all different. What is it about these chairs that makes it a chair? What is the essence of this thing that gives it so-called chairness, right? Well, it's something you sit on, it supports you, you know, there's some quality to it, there's some energy, some quality to it. That quality, that energy for Plato was what he called archetypes. And for each thing in our imperfect universe, in somewhere floating up in the spiritual dimension somewhere, there is a perfect chair, the perfect essence of a chair. And what we do when we make a chair here down on Earth in our regular reality is we are reflecting that essence. And so some chairs may be more perfect than others. Maybe this one's better than that one. And then eventually, for Plato, the idea was that we seek perfection through these archetypes, by trying to approach these archetypes, by trying to approach perfection. Okay? And again, later on, the Christians came with this idea, the same relationship between God and man. Man is created in God's image, and then therefore the spiritual job for mankind, womankind, is to try to become closer to the ideal, which is God. Okay? And the Christian church picks up on that, and they change it around a little bit, but that's the basic idea. So there's these archetypes floating around out there, and so this is the perfect essence of things. And you can think of anything. You know, I could pick a pen, right? And you can think of many different writing implements, all sorts of different ones, you know, from quill feathers to all sorts of things. They all have the essence of that writing implement, of a pen, right? We all recognize what they are. There's some essence about it. There's something about it that is quintessentially a pen, right? And so again, in the Platonic universe, there's a thing out there that's the ideal of this, and that is what Plato called an archetype. So Jung takes this idea of archetypes, but he doesn't exactly stick to the Platonic. It is an ideal thing. It is something out there, but instead of being a chair or a pen, it really has something to do with some aspect of our humanity. So there's a mother out there that represents the essence of mothering. There's a father out there that represents the essence of fathering. There is a trickster out there that represents the essence of this sort of type of human relationship where you're tricked into knowledge. There is for every male, there is a female, the perfect female counterpart. For every female, there's the perfect male counterpart. And on and on and on and on and on. There's just millions of these things. I mean, thousands, millions. Anything that has something to do with human qualities. There's this perfect, idealized energy out there in this collective unconscious that then can come down to us. Okay, and this is for Jung where he derived his version of archetypes from. Okay, and the archetypes for Jung, unlike chairs and pins, the archetypes for Jung tend to be, usually they come to us in sort of a personified form. Even if they're animals, the animals, you know, walk on 2 feet, you know, they'll talk. So these images usually come to us in a personified way, because Jung is really only cares really about human beings and human relationships. He doesn't really care about chairs and pins and cars and books and things like that. He really cares about archetypes that relate to the human experience. Okay, so they're personified images, generally personified images that come to us, and they come out of the collective unconscious, and they attempt to rise to consciousness. Okay. Now, there are possibilities of representation, innate predisposition, and they come to us in images. So that's the first thing. I should have mentioned that first. They come to us in images. The images are most often personified. Okay? Archetypes are present in all people as psychic structure of the common human, physical, psychological condition. You don't directly experience archetypes, but they're approached through their effects in the psyche, including complexes, dreams, myths, etc., etc., etc. There are as many archetypes as there are human experiences: birth, death, development, mother, father, separation, grief, relationships, sex, old age, ad infinitum. Okay, and they're presented to us in anthropomorphic. That's a word you should know. Anthropomorphic. What does that mean? Morphic means shape. Anthro means humans or mankind. We'll extend that to women too. Okay, so they come to us in human shape. Anthropomorphic, big word. These archetypes are like models which other things are patterned after. So there's an essence of a chair up there. The idea of forming a chair comes to my mind, and I go out and I carve myself a chair, right? The same for human archetypes. And the same for human archetypes. I have a baby. I now have to be a father of that baby. Somehow I'm able to channel the essence of what a father is and then model, you know, myself after that archetype. Okay, or that archetype will model me. Okay, it becomes a model. I use that as here's what the essence of being a father is all about, and I will use that to guide my paternal behavior. So archetypes, unconscious structures, they represent energies or principles derived from the collective unconscious. They can function as an entelechy. An entelechy, a vital force that directs an organism toward self-fulfillment. Toward self-fulfillment. Now we're getting a little difference between Freud and Jung. Because for Freud, stuff from the unconscious was a result of pathology. Press all the bad stuff, you don't want to deal with it, and then it makes pathology. And so unconscious stuff is pathological stuff for Freud. For Jung, That is not true. Contact and interacting with this unconscious stuff is something that can lead you to greater well-being, can lead you to a more enlightened state, okay? And this is different. Now we've gone from Freud's, very pathology-oriented clinical psychology to Jung's. And Jung's clinical psychology is not oriented toward pathology. It's oriented toward person, going toward greater self-fulfillment. As people like later on, like Abraham Maslow would say, Jung's psychology is oriented toward self-actualization, greater well-being. Jung's psychology is a form of positive psychology. Doesn't mean it can't be used for doing clinical work with pathologies. It can. But what it's doing is, the idea is that you learn about the unconscious. The unconscious pulls you toward greater self-fulfillment, toward greater well-being. Okay? It's not just the repository of pathology. Okay? And this is a big difference between Jung and Freud. Because for Jung, the unconscious, and especially contact with the archetypes, contact with the collective unconscious through the archetypes, is something that in and of itself can be a healing thing. Okay? So, this idea for Jungians is that if you can maintain an open communication with your unconscious, with the collective unconscious, with these archetypes, through these archetypes, you will be a healthier, more well-rounded, happier, better person. Wow, that's different. That's a different way of viewing this kind of depth psychology. And again, is something that you may be realizing now is very similar to what we find in Asian thought, systems of Asian thought, which almost all of them say, if you can maintain some relationship with this unseen reality that's sort of behind our regular reality, your regular reality will be better. If you have a glimpse of enlightenment, you sit Zen, you have a moment of Satori, your regular waking life will be better. Your interactions with other human beings will be more loving, more positive. You will be a happier person. Okay? We now know this from these studies where they put monks in these MRI machines and you see that their happiness centers of their brains are permanently lit up. So we can actually see some kind of scientific evidence for this. But for Jung, this is the idea, same idea. Okay, so very consonant with Asian systems of thought. And again, I'll let you read this, and then here's a great idea. This thing I was just talking to you about that, Jung talks about these archetypes as biological things, and he also talks about them in a spiritual way. And you can find all sorts of quotes from Jung that show him doing one or the other, often very quickly, switching back and forth. How do you recognize if something's archetypal? How do you recognize an archetypal image? And we do lots of things with archetypal images. They come to us from the unconscious, collective unconscious. They can impinge in our life by binding with something in our own personal unconscious and causing a complex. They can be projected out onto other people or other things. We can do all sorts of things with them. They exist all the time. If you start looking in popular culture, you'll see all sorts of archetypal images and themes. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But how do you recognize archetypal images? They carry a high emotional charge, positive, negative, or both simultaneously. Because like Eros and Thanatos, archetypal energy can also be ambivalent. They have a powerful, compelling effect for an individual. They frequently recur in situations when the rational, conscious mind is not in full control, i.e. dreams, fantasies, sometimes obsessive behaviors, things that people do that don't have any rational explanation. They occur in many different eras and cultures, and you commonly can see that as symbols in literature, art, and life, and you see the same kinds of recurring patterns in dreams, myths, stories, from different parts of the world, from different cultures, including cultures that never had any contact with each other. Okay, so we see these recurring over and over and over and over again. So this is how you might recognize an archetype. We are, to some degree, marinated in archetypes, and especially one archetype, the hero archetype, we tend to be marinated in. That's why I had you read that piece by Joseph Campbell on the hero with 1,000 faces. We tend to be marinated in this. It tends to be one of the defining archetypes of our culture, of our times. Some psychologists, such as James Hillman, who's a Jungian psychologist, have written saying that, you know, we've really become a monomythic culture, a mono-archetype culture, that everything is, the hero myth is, you know, 95% of what we respond to mythologically, and we ignore the other myths. And he says that that is one of the root of some of our problems. Now we're just stuck with one myth, and we don't really get other perspectives. We only get the perspectives from other archetypes. And for Jungians, the archetypes can bring you perspectives. They can bring you, have a certain situation that's going on in your life, and maybe you need to make a decision of some kind, and then you have a dream, and in the dream, you know, an archetypal image will do something. And for Jungians, that is almost like having a trusted, wise friend who has a very specific perspective, give you their opinion about what's going on in your life, and give you advice. And then the idea is that you get those perspectives from a number of different archetypes, and you'll get a very well-rounded view of what's going on in your life. And you use those archetypes as if as advisors, or as you see in some Native American cultures, they might call this counsel, where you go into the unconscious and you're able to commune with these archetypes and get counsel from them. Okay? Jung, for Jungians, this is a way that you use archetypes in a sort of positive psychology way, even if it's dealing with pathological things. Okay? And so we're marinated in this myth, and especially the hero myth. And again, if you look at things like films, the film industry, it's very hard to find a film that does not represent the hero myth. Almost impossible nowadays. Why? They give workshops in LA on the hero myth. Why? Because people especially modern Americans and, you know, other people in developed countries, respond so readily to the hero myth. They know that if they want to make a blockbuster movie and make billions and billions of dollars off the movie, that the more they tie it into the hero myth, the more likely it is that it's going to be successful. So when George Lucas goes to make Star Wars in the late 70s, wearing a Darth Vader shirt, right? Goes to make Star Wars in the 70s. He takes no chances. He calls up Joseph Campbell on the phone and says, "Let's meet, I want you to tell me about the hero myth." And he consults with Joseph Campbell about the hero myth, and then creates a film that is one of the quintessential hero myth films. And like the hero myth, no offense intended, the same story is being told over and over and over and over and over and again in those movies. Each of the Star Wars movies, the plots are almost identical, and they're just telling the same hero myth over and over and over and over again. But you think people would be bored, right? And yet, every time they release a damn Star Wars movie, we all go out and spend, you know, $15, whatever it is now, to go see it, right? Myself included. You know, I know better. I knew what the last Star Wars movie, I knew exactly what was going to be in that movie before I went to see it. I could have sat down and written the plot out. I could have written a screenplay without ever having seen it. But I certainly, if I couldn't have written the exact screenplay, I certainly knew what the plot was going to be. And so what is the plot of the hero myth? What is the plot? It's pretty simple. Pretty simple plot. There is a problem. There's something that is a danger. Okay? It's threatening society, threatening people, threatening existence. And a certain person comes along, and that person is special. And usually that person has something special associated with their birth. So if you're Jesus, your mom's a virgin. If you're Luke Skywalker, your mom's also a virgin, and she has all these, midichlorian floating around in there. You know, heroes have unusual births, unusual early childhood, right? They're special. This marks them as being special. This person grows up, there's a problem, somehow they are chosen, and their job then is to descend in the classical way, descend into the underworld, descend into the dark places, to have a confrontation with the negative, with the bad, with the evil. Okay? Darth Vader, right? Also mixed in with a nice, healthy Oedipal complex, because George Lucas was also Freudian. He liked Freud as well. Or not George Lucas, Joseph Campbell was a Freudian. He liked Freud as well. So we're going to go down, we're going to have our hero myth, and we're going to confront the dark, evil monster down in the depths. We can also make him Luke's father, and we can have a nice Oedipal complex to go along with it, because we also respond to Oedipal complexes pretty well, too. So, you know, George Lucas, smart guy, just got Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell said, throw it all in. Archetypal stuff, archetypal hero myths, and an Oedipal complex. It'll be perfect, right? Of course, we can't resist. We have to go see it. So you throw it all in there. You go down, you have a confrontation with the monster, with the evil, and there's a battle. The epic battle occurs. Okay? There's the epic struggle with the negative, with the evil. Okay? And then the hero then vanquishes the evil and returns back to the light, returns back to the regular conscious, regular reality, but is changed, inexorably changed. Okay, not the same person that he or she was. Okay? And so, and then that's the hero myth. And so we have lots of this. So anybody see the Lord of the Rings movies? Anybody see The Hobbit? That's a good movie. Okay, same. This is a perfect example of this because, you know, Frodo comes back. He's able to put the ring into the thing. You know, get rid of the ring. He comes back, but he's a changed person, and he goes through the last, you know, spends the time, once he's done, goes back to the Shire where he's from, and it's very beautiful, but he just can't relate to it in the same way anymore. And eventually, he just decides to go off with the elves, right? He can't ever change. And Bilbo, who goes in the Hobbit thing, he gets the gold from able to get the dragon slain the dragon, and he comes back, but he's never the same, okay? And this is what you find in hero myths, right? Jesus is buried, and after 3 days rises from his tomb and comes back out, but he's not quite the same. Okay? And so again, this is another thing you see aspect of the hero myth. We are marinated in hero myths. So I always tell every year for somebody to, if anybody can give me an example of a film that is not a hero myth. By the way, you can also have reverse or negative hero myths, where you turn the whole thing around, where it's a bad guy who goes down and encounters the good and then comes back out again. There are variations of the hero myths, which I'm not an expert on, but you can read some writings about these variations of the hero myths. But I always challenge you guys to give me a movie that that is not a hero myth in some way. Very hard to find. Yes?
Do myths relate to Greek mythology?
Yes. Yes. It all relates to Greek mythology. The hero myth comes out of, I mean, in the Western world, the hero myth comes from Greek mythology. I mean, we have, take an example. I mean, the story of Hercules, you know, the 12 tasks of Hercules. Hercules is, so rather than a specific monster down in the depths, he's tasked with these impossible things to do. So he has to go down and confront these things, right? And of course, another guy with a special birth, you know, et cetera. He goes down, he has to confront these things. And at the end, he changes at the end, right? A lot of the Hercules stories at the end, he kind of goes off, doesn't want to deal with people anymore. He goes off by himself. So again, you can pick almost any Greek myth. You can find an example of these, yeah. Yes?
2001?
Yeah, that's been brought up to me before. No, that's a total hero myth. Confronts.
How is the evil?
Yeah.
Goes.
And again, you'll see this pattern in movies, right? Again, if you go to take a class in filmmaking, I'm going a little off tangent here, you'll see that there's this idea where you build up the story, you know, there has to be some kind of, my brother-in-law is a TV producer, told me this, even for reality TV, there has to be a reveal, there has to be a tension, and then there's got to be a reveal, and then there has to be an aftermath. And it, again, follows this path of the hero myth, right? Anybody watching this show, what's it called, American Grit with John Cena? When you watch this reality show, my brother's producing that show. He's executive producer of that. And again, you watch that show, it's hero myth. Take these people out, we got these army guys, they're gonna like run these guys through some like impossible heroic task they gotta do, and you know, some of them are gonna fall by the way, but some will get through at the end, right? After, you know, not necessarily confronting evil, but they might be confronting something that's impossible to do or incredibly difficult, or, you know, that's a hero myth. Very hard to find a film, even a TV show, that doesn't follow this in some way, shape, or form. You can get out some really obscure, weird art films. You may be able to find something. A couple of them out there, maybe, you know.
The 2-hour Yule log that they have on Netflix?
Yeah, yeah, a digital fireplace you can just play on your computer. Yeah, that might be okay. You know, that may be.
Wood trying to overcome the flame.
Yeah, that may be. But I mean, it's very hard to find something. So again, if you're thinking of having a career in Hollywood, and you know, you want to be a writer or a producer or something, you need to learn about the hero myth. You can take one of the workshops down there, screenwriting workshops, And they will go over, they'll get some Jungians to come in there and really teach you this stuff. Or you can just read Joseph Campbell, or because you're in my class and I like you guys so much, you can just listen to it. Okay, you got the whole book on there, and you can get into the details of it. I've often wanted to do a whole class here on Joseph Campbell, and we'll spend a lot of time on the hero myth. When I was in college, I took a class from a poet, and the book that we read in that class was Hero of a Thousand Faces. And we just talked about dreams, and we kept dream journals. It was a really cool class. I always wanted to do that here, but I got to get enough people to be able to run a class. So, if 30 of you want to sign up for it, and you want to do a petition for me to do it, I consider it. Very interesting stuff. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it, but I just want to point it out because, of course, in Asian thought, we also have hero myths. Hero myths are universal. So we have plenty of them in Asian thought. We also have some other myths as well, non-hero myths. And there may be a little bit less emphasis just on the hero myths in Asian thought. However, as Westerners, we will focus mostly on the hero myths. They will be the ones that draw our attention and we will be sucked into. Okay. Yes?
Is that because Westerners focus more on the individual rather than...
Yes. They go, in my opinion, they go together. And, our religions tend to be very heroic. And they tend, again, the Judaic, Islamic, Christian tradition tends to be very heroic. Monotheistic religions, in my opinion, tend to be very heroic. Maybe you can find, I'm open to changing my mind about that. But in my non-heavily considered opinion, I would say they tend to be pretty heroic. Okay, so we have a tendency to sort of go that way. And again, our basic outlook, our basic view of the world, colored by these religious traditions, guides what myths and archetypes we pay the most attention to. And I think in our culture, the hero myth is one of these things. And again, James Hillman has written a lot about that this is not a great thing, that we need to sort of expand our archetypal viewpoint and experience some other archetypes as well. Talks a lot about that. Okay, I talked about the complex already. Let's talk about some of these archetypes, and I'll give you a break. Start with the persona. Now, the interesting about Jungian archetypes is that some are closer to consciousness than others. Some can be, more or less encountered more easily than other ones. And other ones are more difficult. So we start with the easy ones, the persona. The persona is the mask that was worn by actors in activity. Those Greek plays, they wore these masks. So this is where the name comes from. And Jung says this is, I use the word complex here, but you just, complex archetype. It really should be archetype. I should change that. And this represents the role that we typically play in society. This is our PR firm that we have, right? This is the role we typically play in society, is the PR package for the ego. If the persona is healthy, it's not far removed from the ego. And it's flexible, it helps us in social relationships. How many people, it's Friday today, how many people here tonight are on Saturday are planning to go out to a party or an event of something, a social event of some kind? Okay. Just a few of you guys. The rest of you guys are studying, huh? I guess that's good. Okay, those of you guys are going out to one of these social events, and this is a rhetorical question, you don't have to answer this. How many of you are going out with the possibility that you might meet a romantic partner, or you're going out with somebody you're already romantic with? A couple of you, yeah. Okay, so, now, you're getting ready to go out. Let's just say, for instance, you don't have a romantic partner yet. And as my wife likes to say, you're going to be getting the bait ready. Because that's how she talks. So, you're going to go out Saturday night, let's say, or Friday night tonight. You get home from school today, and what do? You go do some homework, whatever, you study, and now it's time to go out. So what do? You just, you've been sitting around at home in your pajamas, you've been eating some stuff, and stuff is drooped all down you. Your feet, you've been wearing the same shoes for the last 3 days, same pair of socks, and now it's time to go out. So what do? What are you going to do when you go out? Clean up. Might take a shower, right? Your shower's done, then what are you going to do? You might do some hair and makeup. Well, it could be a guy doing makeup too. It's possible now. I watched some fashion show the other day, and they had guy makeup. Okay, whatever. You know, no judgment here. Do your hair, do your makeup. Guys, you know, might be combing the beard, the lice out of the beard or something. I don't know. You know, have some, you know, guys and men and women have slightly different rituals. Sometimes they're the same, they overlap, but there's some ritual of getting ready, right? And then you go to put your clothes on. First of all, you're going to probably put on clothes, right? Right? Unless you're going to a nudist colony or something, put on some clothes. Well, do you do like where you go to like, you know, the, oh yeah, you know, oh man, I didn't feel like washing clothes last week, so you just go through the hamper and you just pick out the least dirty clothes, smell them, right? That one's not too bad, I'll put that on, right? No. What do? You get freshly clean clothes. You might iron them so they're really nice and not things, right? You might put on not your cheapest clothes, right? I got a sweatshirt I bought over at Target. Yeah, I'll just wear that, right? What, are you going to wear that out to possibly meet somebody? No. You're going to put on your nice clothes, right? And for guys, by the way, what is the article of clothing? This is an aside. What is the article of clothing you should be very concerned about when you're going out to possibly meet a romantic partner? Shoes. Who said shoes? Shoes. Women pay attention to your shoes. So, rather than buying that new muffler for your car to make it sound louder, and then complaining that you can't get a date and you can't get a girlfriend, go out and spend $500 and buy yourself a nice pair of Bruno Magli, you know, really nice shoes. That is the key relationship advice. And if it works, let me know. Or if it doesn't work, let me know. But this is something that people actually did studies on this. So your guy, you put on your nice Bruno Magli shoes, you know, nice, you go out, and you look at yourself in the mirror, and you go, wow, I look really good, right? Look, hair's all perfect, you know, got my stuff on, got my good shoes, right? How does that image in the mirror relate to your everyday life? I look around the room here and I notice nobody here is dressed up like that for my class. Which I'm very happy about because I would feel very intimidated because you can see how I dress, right? So how does that relate to your everyday life? What you are seeing, that image, that is the manifestation of the persona. That is the persona archetype, okay? Now, if that image is really far afield from who you regularly are, so you go out with, say you're a guy, you go out with a nice girl, and she's thinking, wow, this guy dresses in a $1,000 suit and Bruno Maglis, and you know, he rented a Lamborghini for the date, and you know, like, oh wow, you know, he must be the greatest guy. And then she decides to go out with you, and then finally you invite her home, and you show up in your regular clothes like shorts and flip-flops and a t-shirt, and you're driving a 1989 Honda Civic, you know, with 3 matching wheels and 1 non-matching. You know, that's a big problem, right? That your persona and your actual ego are far removed. Okay, so you don't want to overdress. You know, you want to also dress to be comfortable. Or if you wore let's say you went out for the date and you wore a gold lame suit, right? You'd feel uncomfortable, right? So you want there to be some fundamental relationship between your persona and your ego. Okay, that's healthy. And when you see the persona and the ego really far apart, that is when you have to wonder about the person's mental health a little bit. Okay. In other words, you know, I go out on a date and I do all this fancy stuff, but you know, I feel totally uncomfortable doing this, and I spend all my money on the date, and I got to go home and eat ramen for the next week. That's unhealthy. Okay. So this is how Jungians see the persona. This is how the persona archetype comes through. And so even now that I've mentioned it to you, you have a sense of what that is like in your own life, right? How many people here have been on a job interview? Show up at the job interview in flip-flops and shorts and a t-shirt? No. You put on, you presented the best image of yourself that you could present. That's the persona, okay? That's what the persona is, okay? Very close to conscious. Now, on the other side, the opposite, is the shadow. And this is the inferior, forgotten part of you. Qualities and traits you prefer to hide from view, things you find unacceptable in ourselves. The shadow may have some, in my opinion, some relationship with Freud's idea of thanatos. It can be aggressive. It can be dishonest. The shadow counterbalances pretension of the persona. And the persona counters the antisocial tendencies of the shadow. Shadow is not always negative. Sometimes positive things can be unaccepted or hidden away as well. We're not going to go into that, but if you had a class on Jungian therapy, you'd learn about sort of positive shadows sometimes you can see. A shadow is found in dreams projected on the outside world of the other, but the shadow, unlike the persona, is not easily accessed. Shadows in the deeper parts of the unconscious, in the collective unconscious, harder to get to. However, just by the fact that I've mentioned the shadow to you in class today, some of you may go home tonight or in the next few days and have a shadow dream. And many of us, if not all of us, have had a shadow dream at one point. You ever had this dream? You have a dream, and in that dream, there is a character. And he's usually hidden, sort of in the dark. You can't really see him really well, but you have a sense of malice, or a sense that person's going to trick you, or a sense of danger from that person. Okay? Now, in many of our dreams, that shadow will present as a sort of dark character. That doesn't mean that their skin color is dark. Sometimes that's the case. But of course, you know, if you're a person with dark skin color, you might, your shadow figure may be, you know, somebody with a lighter skin color, right? It's whatever you find to be menacing, scary. But a lot of times, that shadow is literally hidden in the shadows. You can't see them really well. And they're there, and there's a feeling of menace, and you're worried, you're thinking, yeah, I think I'm going to get away with that person. That's not, this is dangerous being around them. Anybody had that feeling in a dream? The shadow? This is very, very common. And sometimes the shadow is, you so don't want to deal with it that you will do something, you use a psychological defense of projecting it out onto someone else. So Ronald Reagan famously said that the Russians, the Soviet Union was the evil empire. He projected his negative stuff, his shadow, onto the Soviet Union, right? And then later on, when Gorbachev took down the wall, he was like, I see no evil, you know, he recanted that. But his original thing was to project his shadow stuff out. So we do this. Unfortunately, we do this with people who don't look like us. It's an unfortunate thing about human beings. And we have this sort of inbuilt tribalism. And this leads to all sorts of problems in the world. This leads to all sorts of racism. It leads to all sorts of tribalism. Leads to wars. Leads to nationalism. You know, us, not them. The them, they must be bad. They're different. There's probably some evolutionary reasons for doing that. We're not going to go into that here. It certainly doesn't excuse any of this kind of behavior. It's something that if we can be aware of it, if we can be aware of the shadow, then we can be aware of our own projections of the shadow out onto other people. Instead of seeing them as bad or evil or as a shadow projection, we can see them as other human beings. And then if we see them as other human beings, we don't have to fight them. And that would make the world a lot better place, right? You know, Kim Jong-un right now, he's seeing, you know, the United States, he's projecting his shadow stuff onto us. And the fact that he just exploded a 5th nuclear weapon, it's not really good. Because, you know, the shadow, you put it out there, you want to get rid of it in yourself, so what you do is you project it out, and then if you eliminate it in the outside world, then you can pretend to yourself that you've eliminated it inside. You can just be all good, and you can get rid of all the bad parts of yourself. But it doesn't work that way. Okay? So the shadow thing is something we deal with a long time. If we had a class on psychopathology, I could talk to you a lot about the shadow. The Freudians have a similar idea about good and bad objects. Those of you who've taken classes with me and I talk about object relations, modern Freudian theory, very, very similar way it works. It's very similar to how the shadow works. Again, remember I told you Freud and Jung, not that far apart. And this projection out of the negative, projection out of the bad, this is also very common. The Jungians recognize this as the shadow thing. So the shadow, so as a Jungian, to deal with this, what you want to do is you want to open up a dialogue with the shadow. And the more you're able to actually confront the shadow and talk to the shadow and have a dialogue with it, the less frightening it'll become. And actually then can become a very, very useful ally to help you. Because let's just say, you know, you're in a work situation and, you know, you've got a superior at your work who is constantly dumping all their work on you, and you don't feel like you can say anything. You just sit there, oh yeah, I just take it. You're really pissed off about it, but you don't feel like you can express it. You're not confident enough to express it. But then you go in, you do some therapy, in your therapy, you have dreams and you have shadow dreams, and you analyze those in your therapy, and over time, your shadow is able to speak to you more, and your shadow says, you know, you're being a wimp. You need to stand up and not let somebody take advantage of you, right? And you can actually start channeling that shadow energy, and then the person comes and gives you the work, and you go, I'm not gonna do that. You know, you're giving me your work, I'm not gonna do your work for you. You know, the shadow can give you that energy. And so, you know, the shadow can help you be appropriately assertive. The shadow can help you manifest, you know, aggression when it's necessary, okay? And so it can be a very, very useful ally, but we tend to repress it. It tends to be, tend to not want to deal with it. And it's coming up there, bubbling up under the collective unconscious. And, you know, this is a thing very typical. You go see a Jungian therapist, probably most of us would have shadow issues. Very common. Yes?
Where does the shadow lie in our, I guess, like, the sections of, like, the id and the ego?
Well, don't think of it that way. Think of it in the Jungian way. It's really coming out of the collective unconscious. Remember, it's the idealized form of somebody who is bad. You remember, like the chair, that aspect of chairness. This is the aspect of badness, of evilness, of aggression. It's that archetype. It's that idealized representation of that stuff that comes up through the collective unconscious, and then may interact with your stuff that you have in your own unconscious. And then again, come to you as a, you know, in the dream, it'll come to you as usually a personified figure, literally hidden in the shadows. Literally, you know, the shadow is a good name for it. Yes?
Like depression.
Can be part of depression. Part of depression, you know, the Freudians talk about depression as being anger turned inward, right? So, you know, again, for Jungians, the shadow is like, you know, repressing the shadow can cause you to turn the anger in yourself to hold it in, and communicating with the shadow can allow you to express the anger, express your desires, your anger appropriately. Okay, you can be assertive instead of angry, right? And that's the idea: is you take your anger and you make it into something that is useful. Now, again, we're going to touch on this subject again when we talk about Tibetan Buddhism. We're going to touch on the shadow because we're going to talk about these wrathful deities in Tibetan Buddhism, which are very much like shadow images. And again, the Tibetans use this shadow energy, they transmute it into something useful. And it's the same idea, that anger, for instance, for Tibetan Buddhists, you know, transmuting the anger can lead to great clarity. And I'll talk about that when I get to these. Okay, so remind me about that. Yes?
So if someone's persona is healthy and like their ego and persona are balanced, would they have like less of a shadow?
Maybe, maybe not. I mean, they can be related and they can be non-related. Just depends on their own stuff. Because again, remember the complexes get mixed up. It's the mixing up of whatever you're repressing from your life, you know, from your life history, in reacting with that archetype, and then mixing up. So you could have a shadow issue and have maybe your persona is fine, but you have some kind of undealt with shadow issue, or they might impinge upon each other. It's very possible. But again, your dreams will tell you that. Okay, if you have a dream, you know, your dreams are the key to this stuff. I'm going to talk about dreams in a minute. Okay. But I've gone on quite a long time, so let's take a little break. How about 10 minutes, because we've got a lot to get through. Okay.